Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov. So, by way of apology, someone pointed out to me that this is Shabbat number 15 since the morning on Shmini Atzeret when we walked in and found out that the world had been turned upside down. And people apparently keep track of this stuff. Someone said that 11 out of the past 15 Shabbats, I have talked about Israel or anti-Semitism. I would note that I was away for 2 of those. But I think everyone here came knowing that I was going to share, having just been in Israel for a week with a delegation, a mission of solidarity with over 20 leaders of our Atlanta Jewish community, that I was going to share some reflections, and a few reflections, and really the only question was how I define the word "a few." So the Torah portion we read this week begins Ve'ele hamishpatim. And so we have just had the storm and drang, the thunder and the lightning of the giving of the Torah. And the next thing, and the Jews have just escaped hundreds of years of slavery in Egypt. And the first civil law that they get, the Ve'ele HaMishpatim, is actually the laws of slavery. In a very strange way, even though they have just had the 2 most remarkable experiences in Jewish history, 50 days apart, they have come out of Egypt, they've had plagues, they've had thunder and lightning in the giving of the Torah, life as usual continues. And in some ways, the most important thing that I can reflect to you about my experience in Israel is in some way what is happening in Israel at this very moment. So on the one hand, life in Israel is totally upended. Over 100,000 Israelis are internal refugees in shelters, in hotels. We also have Israeli families that we are working to support here in Atlanta and around the world. And of course, there are over 100 families that are waiting for word of their loved ones held hostage, captive in Gaza. When you come into the airport, the first thing you see is not the throngs of tourists, but posters as you walk down the hallway that brings you from the arrival area into the passport control area. That hallway is lined with posters of those whose return is awaited. And when you leave, the hallway going the other direction has the same decor. Although much less common than they were, there are still air raid sirens. So we were in Tel Aviv, and it had been quiet for almost a month because Israel's army working in Gaza had eliminated many of Hamas's rockets. But the tour operator arranged special on that day. And so in Tel Aviv, you have about 90 seconds from when the alarm sounds to when you had better be under something reinforced. And so those 90 seconds, you go from a siren, really, is that what that sounds like, to open the door of the goddamn bus, to, wow, Iron Dome looks really cool when it's working. And as some of you know, we ended up taking shelter in a BMW dealership. So I don't think Jews have ever been so grateful for German engineering as we were in that moment. And it was funny because there's an app that every Israeli has that tells you where the rockets are aimed at, where they're hitting, and whatever. And Cantor Yoav texted me, like, where are you? You should really get under cover. Like, no, I'm looking at the rockets. And so as it turned out, the rocket that was aimed at us fell a couple of miles away. And we actually, someone who was nearby sent me video. Apparently it took off the rear bumper of somebody's car on its way down. I don't know how you claim that on your insurance. But that's the thing, right? Israelis are used to that. So even in the midst of life being totally upended, restaurants are open, malls are open. There are people walking around and doing things. And so even though there are hundreds of thousands of Israeli soldiers called up out of the reserves, even though life for individuals is totally upended, society somehow continues to function. Living a normal life when people are actively trying to kill you is actually kind of how Israel has worked for the past 75 years. So as I reflect on what it means to have this experience, I want to point out a couple of themes from this week's Torah portion that help me structure, organize, think about. And I recognize that I can't tell you everything this morning because you would not like it if I spoke for that long, but they're posted on my blog, on Facebook. There is a forum next week to share more. But one thing that happens in this week's portion, which is actually, I think, very instructive to this moment, is there's the idea of a thief haba b'machteret, a thief, a criminal who comes into your home through, of all things, a tunnel. And the rule is that if they are tunneling in during the day when no one's home, when they're just looking to steal property, they have certain rights, even though they are a criminal. If they tunnel in at night, if you know that their goal is that if they find you, they will kill you, ein lo damim, that they literally have no blood, which figuratively means that they take their lives into their own hands. And from this, the rabbis derive the principle, habar lo hargacha, if someone comes to kill you, you have the right to kill first and even to be preemptive. So I think a major difference in Israeli society is that a year ago, many Israelis thought of Palestinians as, if you will, in Gaza in particular, as thieves during the day. That perhaps they were looking to cause trouble, but ultimately their goal was some form of coexistence, that this was all just posturing, right? That they're firing rockets, and if any one of those rockets gets through, people are killed. But we have Iron Dome, so it's just a game that we're playing. And the rhetoric that was coming out was just overblown. And I think Israeli society as a whole, with very few exceptions, now says, you know, when Hamas leadership says something, when Iran says something, we're going to believe them. And so Hamas has this tunnel system, which is, to say that it is more sophisticated than MARTA is really not saying anything, right? But it is bigger than the London Underground, typical of Israeli black humor. So Tel Aviv has for years been trying to build a subway system, and it has gone nowhere. There are these half-built systems. So it is a common joke in Israel, if only Hamas would come and finish our tunnels. But what has happened now is that 100 days, which happened, we are now on day 127, 100 days seemed to be this kind of shift. So Israel has pulled many of its reserve units out of Gaza, and that even though there is talk of moving into Rafah, into one of the last areas that Israel has not swept, that Israel has pulled its troops back. And you may think that this is because things are dying down, but I want to warn you that, in fact, it's because of something else. So the real player in the region is Iran. So Iran is led by mullahs who have a particular vision of Islam that is apocalyptic in nature, right? Their goal is literally the end of the world, because only when there is an apocalyptic final battle will the hidden imam be revealed. And so they will support whoever helps them reach that goal. So Sunnis and Shias in general don't get along, but Hamas is a Sunni movement, but Iran provides training and resources and money because it brings them closer to that goal. I want to tell you, by the way, that there is a miracle of October 7th that nobody talks about, which is that Hamas, for all of the horrific things that it did, was, the fighters who were sentenced, like, we are going to take Jerusalem, we are going to take Tel Aviv, they were never going to get. It's horrible that they got as far as they got. It's only because Israel had its pants down. But on Israel's northern border is another group funded by Iran called Hezbollah. And To this day, nobody knows why, when Hamas attacked from the south, Hezbollah did not attack from the north. One of my friends joked, well, maybe Nasrallah had a personal training appointment that morning and he didn't want to cancel. He was insulted, they didn't invite him. But as I understand it, Lebanon, although it is not a fun place to fight at any time of the year, during the rainy season, no one wants to have a war in Lebanon. And so everyone is really gearing up because they think that that is the next front that might open up. And Israel at the time was in no way ready for a two-front war. So one of the things you need to about Israel is that if you are a normal visitor to Israel, the three most important cities, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and then maybe it's Beersheba or Haifa. If you are from Atlanta, the third most important city in Israel is Yokneam, because you must visit there, because it is our partner city. It's actually a city that was kind of left behind by Israel's development, and we are helping them catch up. High tech has moved in, but it's still a city that needs to be brought up to speed in certain ways. And so we actually spent a morning helping paint a bomb shelter, refresh a bomb shelter in Yokneam. And the reason they're doing that is because they think they're going to need them. Now, I don't really know who needs a mural painted by the rabbis of Atlanta, but that's a different question. But one of the things that I think unites Israelis across the board, which has not been true for an Israeli conflict in a long time, is that Israelis, I think, are very much united that Israel had to do what it did. That Israel could not sit around and let this happen, because if it did not, that would be the end of Israel. A more complicated conversation is, even if it is a just war, is it being fought justly? I would argue that by and large it is, right? That there is no other nation, there is no other army that invades an area that provides safe zones, that drops leaflets, says, go here, we're attacking there. The whole point is surprise. But also I want to point out who is fighting this war. So 300,000 reservists were called up. And I was watching an interview on Israeli TV that really summarized for me what this all is. So how many of you have ever experienced the Israeli phenomenon? They call it in Hebrew, kibud kal. No one. So basically when you come to Israel and you visit, they put out this urn of really black coffee, it's more grounds than water. And there's beastly, which is Israeli Fritos, and these pretzels that don't have any salt on them, right? That's the snack that you get when you these cups that are so flimsy, it's a wonder they can hold liquid. And these weird 1.5 size liter bottles of Coke, they're not personal sized, but they're not American sized. So when I saw on video these Israeli troops, 20, 19 years old, putting out kibud kal, right? Putting out Israeli refreshments for the reporters, and they're wearing flak jackets and helmets, and they're making this terrible coffee, and they're chatting in a living room where the wall is blown out, and they're looking out over Gaza, and they're explaining what they did, and they're well, we have to blow up that mosque. Why do you have to blow up that mosque? Well, because that's the mosque that the people where they set up the attack to attack such and such kibbutz, and underneath there's a huge bunker system, and there's no way to destroy the bunker system without also destroying the mosque. And so you watch, they press a button, there goes the mosque, falls through the basement, the sub-basement, all the bunkers are destroyed. But these are 19 and 20-year-olds doing this. But here's the other thing about Israelis. Israelis trust the army in a way that I think very few other nations do, because they are the army, right? Unless you are Haredi or Israeli Arab, you and the people you know, the army is not random people, it is you, it is your nephew, it is your neighbor. And so, most of the people in the army, people you have in fact trusted your life to. Now, the Israeli army also has that guy you wouldn't lend $20 to. But for the most part, Israelis trust the army because they know what happens, because they've been there, that was them. And in fact, morale is higher in the army that has been in many years. So there are soldiers who are injured who are demanding to go back into battle. There's a sense of duty, a sense of purpose. We were at Har Herzl. We were there for the funeral of a commander who fell. He was the head of a unit, which, by the way, tells you something, right? If you were the head of the unit and you're up at front, that tells you something about what people are doing and how people feel about what they're doing. He was the father of 2 young children, and his wife and his brother and his sister were speaking at this funeral, and they were bemoaning his loss. There was such grief, but there was also a sense of duty, a sense of purpose. So Har Herzl, which is Israel's military cemetery, they estimate how many graves they're going to need in a year, right? When they're going to need to open up a new section. They use 20 years of graves in a few weeks. And yet people are saying this price is unbearable, but they are not saying that it is too high. There's a sense of resilience. So our portion this week says, "You shall not curse a leader amongst your people." And this is actually a sermon I gave last year. I went and looked. It was the beginning of this whole fight in Israel about judicial reform, about Israel's civil society, which was kind of put on the back burner. How was Israel going to function as a constitutional democracy? And what's interesting is all of the people who were protesting put down their signs, took up their weapons, and went to the front. And the ones who didn't go to the front turned in that moment from protesting to doing what the government was not able to do, which is actually provide relief efforts, setting up warehouses, collecting supplies, doing logistics. And so what's amazing is that one thing that unites the right and the left in Israel at the moment is a sense that the government fell down on October 7th. So I think you're going to see a generation of Israeli leaders arising whose moment as leaders, the day when they realized they needed to step up, was the day that they were serving in Gaza and realizing that they were the ones carrying out the mission and protecting the people and not the folks back in Jerusalem. And the people who said, you know what, the people in those government offices are not getting the weapons, are not getting the vests, are not getting the food to the people who need them, and so we're going to do it. And frankly, a country run by those people is better off than the country being run by who it's being run by now. Our Torah portion says, Lo tisa shemashav al tashet yadcha im rasha liot eid chamas. Everyone recognize the last word. You shall not bear false witness to be a false. Hamas means a witness. Hamas in Hebrew means violence or falsehood. So one of the things that we continue to see in the world is the war of truth against falsehood. So when you see body counts that come out, etc., one thing I need to point out is that Hamas does not differentiate between civilians and fighters. That does not exist to them. So then when they release a number that 30,000 have been killed, so first of all, when you drop 10,000 rockets, 10,000 bombs, and you manage to kill 30,000 people, you have either had the best or the worst aim in history. But secondly, when you look at the numbers, Hamas doesn't separate how many of those people were fighters. And by the way, some of their fighters are as young as 10, right? So when a 10-year-old is coming at you with a gun, you can't treat them like they are 10. You have to treat them like they are holding a gun. And so this war of false witness is one that is actually being fought not in Israel, but everywhere else, and this is our war to fight. So as some of you may have noticed, so on my way back from Israel, I had a 12-hour layover in Boston on purpose, and I went to visit another beleaguered Jewish community, visited the Jews of Harvard, and what I will tell you is that the war of ideas that is being fought, this was actually started by the Russians 50 years ago. Zionism is racism. Those seeds that were planted took a long time to germinate. And so, in fact, the war of ideas is one that we need to start fighting now. But it is not even with the current students. It is with the people, but it is with the people who will be the academics, the thinkers, the talking heads 30, 40, 50 years from now. the front of the war of 2062 is being fought today. One or two final thoughts here. Our Torah portion says, "V'ger lo toneh v'lo telachatzenu." You should not oppress a stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. One of the situations that is, I think, very complicated is that for Israel's non-Jewish citizens and residents. And so, when you talk to Israeli Arabs, there is uncertainty, there is distrust, but for the most part, the Israeli Arab community has stood behind the Jewish community. And so, in fact, we were in Israel, and I want to point out, this is a fun fact. So one of the neat things about being in Jerusalem is that I can pick what synagogue I want to go to, and people in our group went to many different synagogues. So I went to a conservative synagogue where I've been going since I was a kid. Other people went to like a hipster minyan in one of the cooler areas of town. Dove went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Did they give you an aliyah? How was the kiddush? Right, that's what I want to know.
There was a lot of wine.
Don't drink the wine and don't eat the little crackers. But some of my colleagues went to the Great Synagogue where they were hosting a Shabbat honoring the Druze. And this is the Druze are an outgrowth of the Shia movement of Islam, who are extremely Zionistic, who serve in the Israeli army. And as I understand it, not only were services were 3.5 hours long, because it was such a love fest between Jews and Druze of like, look, we are here, we disagree about a lot, but we agree on a lot that matters. I also had the opportunity, we met with Pier Battista Pizzaballa, which is a great name, I love saying it, who was the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, who I think was the one who invited Dove to services. So he rules over a diocese. He is the Catholic leader of Jordan, Israel, the Palestinian areas, Cyprus. That is a pretty big area, a lot of conflict to worry about. And he shared with me the drama of that when they were looking to raise money among Arabs in the Galilee for Christians in Gaza, they had a problem, which is that there were members of the Christian church in the Galilee who said, you know, I can't raise money because my children are in the army in Gaza, and I'm not going to send money to the people who are shooting at them. So it is a complicated scenario serving a congregation that is divided. The Torah says, Lo agarshana b'banecha b'shana achat. I will not drive them out in one moment. When the Jews are coming into the land of Israel, this war of coming into the land is not going to happen in just one moment or even 1 year, because you will not be able to manage it. So this war has been going on now for 4 months and 7 days. Is victory possible? What is victory? Nobody knows. I mean, I suppose Yahya Sinwar dead and the hostages returned would be a good start, but no one knows if that's possible. One of the things that I see that perhaps is necessary to understand is that in Hebrew there is a word conceptia, which is very hard to translate into English. Actually, it's concept, right? But the Palestinians and the Israelis have each their own conceptiot. So for a long time there was a conceptia in the Israeli left that if we were just nice enough, that there would be peace. But meanwhile, there was a conceptia amongst the Palestinian leadership that the Israelis are colonialists. And the thing about colonialists is you can drive them back to their mother country, right? So in Algeria, the PLO was founded in Algeria because in Algeria, the Algerians drove out the French, sent them packing, did not leave behind a single baguette when they left. But you know what? The French have France to go home to, and the Israelis have nowhere else to go. And the war will not end until the Palestinians realize that the Israelis are not going anywhere no matter what they do, no matter how horrible the attack. Ein lanu eretz acheret. The Israelis have nowhere to go. But by the way, when I talk to folks when I speak to folks about what's going on the Israeli right, many of them have the same idea that if we just make things miserable enough, that we can drive the Palestinians out. Like, we can get them to move to Egypt, we can, whatever it is, they can go to Dubai. The ones who wanted to leave, left. That somehow we are going to have to figure out how to live in the same land, or it's just going to be this for the next few hundred years. Here's the takeaway. And this is actually something that I learned in conversation with Pier Battista Pizzaballa. I can't say it often enough, the Latin patriarch. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has been the site of violent conflict for hundreds of years, having nothing to do with Jews. What do you know? So the church is divided into areas. So this is the church which is, according to tradition, where Jesus was buried, and every section of Christianity, every sect wants a piece of it. The Roman Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, the Lutherans. The fighting was so bad. In 1902, friars and monks were sent to jail because there was a fight over who would sweep the lowest step of one of the chapels, because that determines who controls it, who sweeps it. A Coptic monk a few years ago moved his chair to a different spot in the courtyard to get out of the sun. 11 people were sent to the hospital. And by the way, these are not soldiers. This is like me wearing a different hat. And yet, after about 1,000 years, right, from 1270 to now, of different denominations fighting over who would control what, they finally figured out and made a deal because they realized they could do the one thing that all religions have in common, have a capital campaign, and renovate it. And so what I would suggest to you as sort of a closing moment here is that sometimes faith does not bring us any closer to answers. And sometimes the solution to problems over even a single step or the location of a chair is measured not in years, but in centuries. But just because something takes a very long time doesn't mean that it will never happen. And so we live in a moment in history which is actually not all that unique, right? People wanting to kill Jews and violence, that's pretty much the same as it was in 1972. That's pretty much the same as it was in 1648, right? This is actually a time in history that is not unprecedented. This is actually a time in history that is entirely precedented. The only good news that I can offer is that we start off at this moment in history a little better off because we have a land of Israel, because we have an army that more often than not we can trust. And so that's why, and we as Jews actually have the ability to stand by each other. That's why we're sending a mission of solidarity and support in about 2 months. That's why, okay, this is time number 11 out of 15. Who knows? Come back next week. Maybe I'll talk about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. Who knows? But that we as Jews understand what it is to live in historic times and what it is to deal with situations, with crises, with drama, with trouble that takes centuries to resolve. If we're lucky, maybe it's only decades. Shabbat Shalom.